Hi everybody, welcome to the tutorial video for the um, next lab, Lab 6. It is Friday morning, 10 o'clock. I apologize for being a day or so late on this. I'm running about 24 to 36 hours behind on everything it seems. So we'll go ahead and get into this lab. So like I mentioned before, I'd only tested this for Oakland in my original map or my original construction, and I wanted to make sure that it worked for other municipalities across the country. So in this example, I'll be using Portland. It will likely show a similar pattern. I haven't run through it, so we're kind of doing it on the fly. Um, my guess is that'll be a similar pattern that we see in every city across the country because that pattern is a pattern based on institutional and economic policy um, situated in like the historical construction of race in this country. So it's probably going to show the same thing. And Portland's and Oregon in general has a long history of being a very segregated place and kind of a low key under the radar way that you don't notice as much as other places. So with that being said, I'm going to look at a few things with this data and this project. So the first thing, in my map boards compilation window here, I set my level of detail. I picked my bounding box around the general Portland area, and then you want to make sure you set your level of detail to city, right? And that's going to be the 1 to 72,000 scale, which is good for this. And then in here on your compilation window, you can have it fit to screen so you can see a little bit more. And this might be a bit more than we need. Ignore this is a previous one. A bit more than we need in terms of geographic extent, but we can always trim down later. So I'll go ahead and make this kind of full size, my compilation window full size, so you can see what we're doing. All right. So working with Portland here, and then we want to go ahead and add some data. So before I add the redlining data, which is what you should add first, I want to look at a couple, um, just to clarify what this data is, and to look at a few components of it that's interesting. So the University of Richmond came out with this kind of interactive web map that explains this data. So this is all the different cities this data should exist for within the Living Atlas. Um, it's 117 data, mostly concentrated, kind of along with the pattern of development, in the upper Midwest and on the Atlantic seaboard here, um, which coincides with where the massive amount of uh, migration from the southern part of the United States into the northern part of the United States that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century, predominantly of black people to work in the factories in Michigan and Illinois and Indiana and New York and Pennsylvania, etc. Um, so a lot of the data is concentrated up here, but there's still plenty of stuff on the West Coast for sure. Um, where that policy extended. So I'm going to use Portland as my example for this particular map. So if you're looking for a city, basically, if you're looking for a city to work with, consult this map first. If we zoom in to like the greater Boston area, for example, there's a bunch of different communities that we could potentially look at within this area. So, do a little research on the front end to see, what, where you want to do your project at. Okay, so that is this website, um, which is this mapping inequality, redlining in the New Deal America, based out of University of Richmond. Just looking at the data in general, just what these maps look like and what they are. They're homeowners loan corporation maps from the 1930s. Yeah, 114 different metropolitan areas across the country. And basically, this is what these maps look like in their kind of original form, right? And they have 4 different designations of areas that range from A to D, where A being the most desirable and D being the least desirable or hazardous. And essentially, the way that the home loan uh, homeowners loan corporation worked, which was a federally funded program, kind of a derivative of the New Deal to get people loans to buy houses, is that based on various qualifying factors, they this federal loan organization would say that you qualify for a loan within these different zones, right? And so in most places, um, black people that were searching for home loans would say that you only qualify for these D zones, right? We won't give you a home loan for these more desirable zones. And the D classification, which is the areas that are marked in red, which is why it's called redlining. Um, those D classifications typically were areas that were closer to industrialization, that were more polluted, that were like the older parts of cities that had more rundown buildings or poor infrastructure or um, things like that, or kind of where immigrant and uh, poor communities had settled already just through the kind of the natural evolution of the city throughout time. And so as a way to keep people of a certain socioeconomic class and a certain color within a particular region. It was kind of the precursor to suburbanization. Suburbanization kind of furthered the segregation. This is kind of like the between the New Deal and the World War II era institutional policy that kind of fueled what would happen next in kind of the suburbanization post World War II process that further segregated communities. So really, this is kind of like laying the framework for a lot of the spatial inequalities and the uneven development that we see in cities today. So you can read more about this. I believe this is the one that I linked in the instructions, and then yeah, just kind of looking at, if you want to look at the Wikipedia page of this program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation program, that was a government sponsored thing within the New Deal. Then you can get a sense of like the more long-term ramifications of the process and like the exact kind of, if you're interested in like the details of this whole process for a research project or just out of curiosity. So that's where I wanted to start, just kind of clarify all that information. So we can go ahead and start adding our data. First thing we're going to do, add content, add layers. We'll add it from the Living Atlas, HOLC. We want to add this one, HOLC redlining polygons. All right, and that is going to give us these polygons for different parts of Portland. And then we will go here to the little option window and go to filter. So we only really want to show the ones that are the D classification, which is the ones that are marked in red right now. So go to filter. We'll go to where grade is D. Apply filter, and that will just keep those ones, those sections. We can change style. We're using this unique single symbol. Go to options, change symbol style. We don't need a fill. Outline, let's make red. You can change the color too. I mean, maybe red's kind of like too obvious or something, I don't know. But go red, maybe like this color red. Something like that. Something that just give you the kind of the broad overview of where these locations are. Hit OK. And that is our redlining data. Super easy to get in. Next step. Let's go back to the instructions. Now we want to add this population demographic data, or popular demographic data. Do that. Add content, add layers, still within this Living Atlas, popular demographic data. This is a huge file here, um, with a whole bunch of different geographic extents and whatnot that we don't really need. Um, so again, you can hit this button down here, toggle display for non-drawing layers. And let's get rid of those ones that we don't need. Okay. So then, if we go into change style on this, for popular, and here's our list of attributes. And we can, I mean, you can change this attribute to, any sort of demographic variable you want, right? For the purpose of this map, for a redlining map, Black African American population is probably the most explicit that you'd want to, or the most kind of correlative that you'd want to do. But there's also in other communities, if you have like a more nuanced understanding of like LA, for example, it might want to look at a different demographic group, and I'm sure you would find similar patterns in a lot of ways. But we'll just kind of stick with the instructions for now. So we will go to this one, counts and amounts, sizes, options. We want to make sure this is divided, right, by the total population. Right? We want to normalize our data, because otherwise, if we don't divide by the total population, then it's essentially just showing a distribution of data. It's just kind of showing the underlying population, right? It's not showing what that rate is compared to other communities, right? So whenever we're looking at population data, especially like census-derived population data, we always, and we're looking at a subvariable of that, like percentage within a certain socioeconomic group, or percentage of a certain race, or percentage of um, families, or single people, or what, female, male, female, whatever kind of like classification that you're making, subclassification you're making within the broader population data. You always want to use this divided by total population factor in order to normalize the data. One thing to take note of, this is 2010 census data, right, which is now 10 years old, and we have a new set of census data coming out shortly. The extent to which that census data was like an effective census that was done is hard to say, but nevertheless. Yeah, so here we are. We have our natural breaks classification, which is fine. 5 classes, which is good. You don't really want to do any more than 5 classes. We have it normalized. We go down here. Maybe we want our minimum pixel size to be like 8. So we don't really want to draw attention to those too much. And then 60 for this maybe. Or maybe we'll go like 10 to 70. This is more just kind of like aesthetic of how it looks within the kind of broader context of your map. You can already see like a pretty, significant kind of population pattern emerge up here in the north part of Portland. Northeast, I believe this is what this neighborhood is referred to. You don't see as much down here, along the southeast or southwest part of the city in terms of that kind of immediate correlation. And I think part of that could be just understanding of Portland and kind of its industrial history along the riverfront. But up here we're seeing that kind of like pattern of the present day rate of people that are Black or African American as percentage of the population is like fairly highly spatially correlated with areas that were historically redlined, right? And so we can see how that policy from 90 years ago still has, or 80 years ago still has like effects on the current makeup of the city. All right. And so now we want to throw in a third variable, which is some sort of environmental health or some sort of an indicator of health, right? So for that, go back to our instructions. We'll go to this 500 cities project, all measures, 17. And we will add content again. What's that? All right, what do we have here? Sometimes when a bunch of layers get thrown on like this, I like to just kind of turn the other ones off to see what I'm working with. So this one looks like just some sort of like metadata layer, so we can go ahead and get rid of that. This one is where the data's housed, and what's this one here? It doesn't really look like. Yeah, I think this is not technically Portland over here, so this is data for outside Portland, so we'll just go ahead and delete that. I don't know. Need that. There we go. That looks good. Yeah, and Portland kind of has a weird kind of curvature shape going around these mountains here, so we might kind of refocus and zoom in our map for our final design to kind of like cut off this bottom left corner. We don't really need. It's not really very useful to our data. All right, so here's what we're working with here. This is that city's project all measures, and so now we're going to go in and pick a measure that we find we want to have interest in. So we go to this counts and amounts color, and let's select a variable first, actually. So, before I went with the asthma, if you went with something like obesity, for example, that might be something that's indicative of food deserts, right? Food deserts typically are locations that do not have access to healthy foods, which typically lead to a higher amount of obesity within the neighborhood, right? Because only people that live in the neighborhood only have access to like fast food and convenience stores. So usually, if you have an obesity indicator, that is highly correlated with lack of access, or with food deserts, or with kind of spatially distributed poverty and whatnot. A lot of these ones do the same thing. Diabetes has that same sort of pattern. Let's go to the asthma, just as like a air pollutant indicator. Okay, and let's see in the instructions what we're supposed to do with this. We want to make sure it has dark for high prevalence and low for light. So we will go back here, go to the options. So that's right, low to high. Since we're using that prevalence measure, right, that's going to be a rate. So this bottom classification is going to be less than 8.4% of the population has been diagnosed with asthma, and then the upper is going to be more than 12.9, right? 12.9 to 17.5. So we'll hit OK. That looks good. Let's resort these in this. I basically want the polygon data on the bottom, right? Then we want our outlines on the middle, and then we want our point symbols on the top. And yeah, we can see, a fairly strong correlation already just with that kind of like surface level analysis, especially up here in Northeast Portland. Yeah, and there's plenty of, visual things that you can do from here to pull that data out, make it more explicit, make it more kind of visually salient within your part of the map. You add labels, add, some sort of, right now I'm just using this kind of like street base map, but maybe we want to do, this dark base map. Maybe not actually. maybe no base map, maybe this like light canvas base map. That works pretty well. And use various levels of transparency and various levels of arrangements of your colors so that they have a nice aesthetic between the three. And you could change this red. You know, red's kind of always a hard color to work with in terms of finding balance with two other colors. So maybe you want to make these like orange outlines or maybe like purple outlines. I mean, you know, red is like indicative of the term that we use, redlining, but that does not necessarily mean that you have to use that color in your map. So those are my three layers. I'm going to go ahead and hit sync, let that generate my Adobe Illustrator document, and should be good to go. Hopefully. Yeah, so if you guys have any questions about the data, how to access the data, like I said, if you're trying to think of a city that you're from or familiar with or whatever, go through and check that University of Richmond. I just typed in HOLC data, and that was like the second or third one that popped up in my Google search. Um, Go ahead. I'll throw it in the Slack too, so you have direct access to it. Go ahead and look at that and find the city that you want to look at, and explore the data. And I'm thinking that you'll probably find a pattern that's very similar to this pattern or the pattern that we saw in Oakland, and that part should be relatively straightforward. And then then you have a lot of space to work on your design to make this you know information kind of pull out and make it salient and present and explicit, right? That's the point of like doing a socially justice or social justice or a environmental justice type of map, right? Is that not only do we want to show the information, right, and like provide space for that data to emerge, right, and like use the right set of conditions and filters to allow those interrelations between history and geography and like lived experience in the present day, how all those things interact, right? We want to bring that to the surface. Um, but the point of a map that brings attention to those issues is also to like be visually salient to like call attention to it, right? So it's like think of it from an activist point of view that not only do you have a message, but you have like a way of communicating, right? So you have a data driven point, but you also have a like rhetorical form that is might be a little bit different than like a map that is depicting some sort of natural process in a more kind of rigorous scientific way, right? Whereas this is thinking more of like let's call attention to this pattern that exists, and let's do so in a way that is like uh, rhetorically explicit, if that makes sense. So, when you're thinking about designing your map, once you get through this kind of data processing point and you get to your design space, like I have over here, right? That's when you can start thinking about, okay, how am I going to like make this data like emerge in a very emphatic and serious way that calls attention to like the injustice of this particular spatial phenomenon. All right, so just do that over the weekend, no big deal, and throw any questions you have in the Slack. I will be around. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. And yeah, enjoy the weekend, and I will see you all on Tuesday. All right, bye.